Hello and welcome back to some more Painting with Bennett. Today is yet another detour away from my ongoing projects. This time I took a small commission from someone in my local tabletop gaming scene to paint some of their Mandalorians from the game Star Wars Shatterpoint. As just a quick aside, the guy I'm painting these for wants to paint the bases himself, so that's why the bases will remain unfinished throughout the video. The other big twist is that I decided to paint these minis with non-metallic metal armor, which did take a lot of time, but personally I think it works really well on these minis. But without any more rambling, I'll just get right into it, starting with Bo-Katan and her Clan Kryze, is that how you pronounce it? Mandalorian allies. But before the actual painting starts, I planned out the scheme a little bit. I drew a lot of inspiration from the artwork and paint jobs shown by Atomic Mass Games, as well as from Sir Astro's excellently painted Mandalorians. Bo-Katan's armor in the studio paint job is pretty light steel, but in the show it's actually a fairly dark, cold gray sort of metal color. I have a soft spot for the Jango Fett style bright, shiny blue and silver armor, so I wanted to keep it a bit brighter. In some depictions, the jumpsuits can be kind of bluish, but I wanted to keep them fairly neutral to not make the minis too busy. Now to start the painting, I first mapped out a blue zenithal highlight, just starting with a very dark blue, and working my way through a couple passes up to a pure white. I also airbrushed this white very heavily around the Jetpack flames. Then I did a very thin airbrush layer of dark blue back into the shadows, just to redefine the ones that got a bit too blown out by the highlights. Next I airbrushed the smoke trails, starting first with a yellow color around the jets, and then a bright orange color continuing down the trails. Around halfway down the trail, roughly where the smoke starts to become billowy, I switched to a medium gray color. But before I actually airbrush this, I wrap silly putty around the legs, and I do this so that I don't accidentally get any of this gray paint on the nice zenithal highlight that I made on the armor. Then, as I get lower down in the smoke trail, I transition to a mix of a darker gray color, trying to really create a strong value difference between the bright yellow of the jets of flame and the dark color of the bottom of the smoke trail. Also, this right here is most of the reason that I really like masking, because look at how satisfying that is. Oh my gosh. Switching to the regular brush now, I started with a wet blend of a medium gray and a dark gray mix onto the jumpsuits. On the other two minis I painted off camera, I did end up switching to just doing a semi-translucent base coat, using a dark gray diluted with some glaze medium. Make sure to put some dark gray or black in the eye visor as well, and into the cracks between the armor. It helps if the paint has a good bit of glaze medium or water in it for this part, so that it flows nicely into all the recesses. The jumpsuit is still a little too bright after this, so then I just used a black wash to define the recesses and darken it down a bit. I did feather this out a bit with a wet brush where needed as well, and also in retrospect, speed paint would have worked just as well for this, instead of doing the whole base coat and wash step. Speaking of speed paint, I mixed a warm brown speed paint color to apply over the belts. I didn't bother painting all of the small, tiny leg straps right now, so that's why you'll also see some of those stay gray until later on in the painting process. And moving on to defining the armor, here you can see me sketching out some thin layers, mostly using successively darker gray colors placed in the shadows, and using a damp brush to feather out the edges. I didn't really have any exact process or steps here. I just kind of used a mix of layering and wet blending and glazing and feathering, whatever felt right at any given moment, kind of interchangeably. On one of the Mandalorians that I painted off camera, I even started with like a dark gray base coat and then worked lighter from there, instead of working from light to dark. I did also experiment with using some glazes of Pro-Acryl Payne's Gray in the shadows, but that ended up being too blue of a color. I do want the Beskar armor to have a cool blue hue to the shininess, but I think that this Payne's Gray made it too dark of a blue, and I want the blue to be a little bit more of a hint in the midtones. I'm also not fussing too much at this point about keeping smooth transitions between my colors. I'm just sort of roughly sketching out the shadows and highlights, and I can refine it a little bit more later. Then, after getting some colors roughly mapped out, I blocked in all of the armor panels that I wanted to be blue. On some of the armor panels, I started by wet blending a dark blue to a light blue filter over the panels, but after a while, on most of the panels I switched to just doing one thin base coat instead of trying to do all of that wet blending. I also decided to paint these panels as a continuation of the NMM effect as well, which is entirely personal preference. A lot of depictions of Mandalorians have these painted armor panels not being reflective and shiny looking, but sometimes it does at least look like shiny paint, and I just decided that I wanted it all to look like non-metallic metal so that it would all sort of fit in better. But again, totally personal preference. Anyway, the armor looks really messy right now, but that's what refining is for. I glaze shadows into the blue to keep bringing it darker, and I start doing some highlighting as well. I just keep working on this for a while, and with those edge highlights, and the sort of scratchy specular highlights I guess they might be called, being in place now, it's definitely starting to come together. There's no secret sauce here, just a good amount of work getting the shadows, midtones, and highlights how I want them, and trying to make it decently smooth. Speaking of, I decided the blue looked too blue and not teal enough, so I used a jade color to tint the midtones a little bit more towards a greenish color. The steel is just more of the same. With a gradient that I'm decently happy with, I then do several layers of edge highlights, starting very thick and then getting thinner with the very brightest highlights, working my way all the way up to pure white. Then it's just a lot, and when I say a lot, I mean definitely a lot, of time spent on these edge highlights. There are all sorts of different edges on the armor panels on these models, and I found myself constantly flipping the models sideways and upside down and backwards, just to get the right angle to pull the side of my brush along the edges. And regarding those smooth or not always as smooth transitions, if you know anything about my painting style from past videos, you'll know that I care a lot about high contrast and punchy highlights, but not so much about having exactly perfectly smooth gradients. I think there's a little bit of an obsession with it, and, to be fair, they do look awesome when they're pulled off right. But I think a lot of the time it's just not worth the effort, and once you start seeing things like these edge highlights coming in on the models, you kind of don't really notice as much that the blends aren't always so smooth. Now again, definitely I'm not saying that smooth blends don't matter at all, or that you're part of a wretched hive of scum and villainy if you do use smooth blends all the time. I'm just saying that for me, the amount of effort it takes to do that is effort that's much better spent doing nice punchy highlights somewhere else. Anyway, with that armor all finally wrapped up, I move on to various small refining steps. I start by blocking in a brown color underneath the straps or belts, and then just doing some simple and straightforward highlights. Since the surface area of all of these belts and things are so small, you don't have to be really precise with these things. Just one or two simple highlights in the general area they're supposed to be is good enough. Then I decided to finish painting the jumpsuit. I went pretty simple with this, just using some colors I already had on my palette, and doing a couple pretty neutral scratchy highlights. I also pushed these highlights pretty bright around the area where the jetpack flames are, because naturally those areas would be very bright, of course. And also when I do the object source lighting effect, this will be a great undercoat to build on that effect. I paint yellow glows on the little armor badge things, and I also paint yellow and red on some of the wrist weapon button things. Just kind of at random, picking ones that I think will look interesting to have accents. Then I just go over each of these with one simple highlight, just mixing white into the original color to get a highlight. I was also a little messy around where I painted some of the visors and helmets, so I just did some cleanup around the borders of those as well. Bo-Katan also has these special little decorations on the front of her helmet on the white part, so I just cleaned up around there and painted some white over the raised portion of the symbol, where I dropped a bit of blue wash in earlier. Moving on to the jetpack flame effects, I did a little bit of messy glazing or kind of shading of white, yellows, and oranges into the inside of the smoke effect. It should really look like it's glowing from within and getting more gray as it gets to the outside of those sort of clouds, so I want to drop these brighter sort of highlight colors on the inside recesses of the clouds. The part that should look the brightest is also the inside core of that flame effect, and so that's why I dropped some pure white in there. Just like some of the earlier steps, there's no hard and fast rules about how many layers I do of certain paints or which exact mixes I use where. I just sort of feel out what seems right and do kind of however much painting I feel like I need to. Then I do a final airbrushing of yellow and orange fluorescent paints around the jetpack flame, with plenty of messy spillover around this flame for an easy object source lighting effect. When I did this, I had to mix a little bit of yellow and orange together to get a color that was just right, and when I airbrushed this, I avoided the very core of the yellow glow, since I didn't want the orange to totally cover it up. I just kind of airbrushed this orange all over the middle of the smoke trail, and got plenty of spillover onto the legs and waist to really emphasize that glow effect. You could definitely be a lot more subtle with the glow if you want, but when I paint things like object source lighting, I like to make it really impactful when I can. Then off camera, I also just did a few final cleanup touches. Mostly this is just adding brush highlights around where the jump pack fire is for that final push on the OSL, and I used some thin white and yellow paint to put some pop back into the center of the jump pack flames. I think there were also some random tiny cleanup fixes I had to do, but then that's pretty much it. I'm really liking how these turned out, and it's a great motivator to already see half of this project completed. I'm not an expert at non-metallic metal by any means, but I hope this inspires some of you watching this to try out the technique. It's definitely not fast and definitely not easy, but honestly it's pretty fun, and I think it's great practice both for placing highlights and getting really comfortable with doing edge highlights. Now time to paint the resident bad boys. The main planning I did here was deciding to keep their black armor mostly a neutral black or a dark gray color. Otherwise, I decided to more or less follow the box art in terms of which armor panels are red and which are black. I also started off thinking of doing the exact same airbrush process as for the blue Mandalorians, thinking that the cold blue zenithal would be a great start for all of the dark grays and for all of the reds and a nice cold shade on the armor. But I thought about it some more and I decided to pivot, and I re-airbrushed the minis with a very dark bluish grayish black. I didn't go with a pure black, so that I can still do some more darkening glazes or shades later on my own, and so that the mini doesn't just look too pure black, because I think that gets a little boring. I also did add some highlights back in, first with a dark bluish gray and then a lighter bluish gray, but I was much more restrained, and generally tried to map these highlights specifically to where the NMM highlight would be placed on each surface. Then I wasn't totally sold on all of this work I had done with the airbrush, but, I decided it was good enough. So I used a red speed paint on all of the red armor panels, intentionally picking a pretty bright red to hopefully a little bit offset the really dark grayish undercoat. Then, once I was dry, I put a heavy black wash over the whole mini except for the jetpack fire and smoke trails. That wash darkened down and defined everything nicely, so then once that dried, I just started the long process of highlighting the armor. The black luckily didn't need too many layers. I just did 1 or 2 gentle highlights of gray, and then moved on to some strong edge highlights. Even though the surfaces are black, I wanted to push the highlights very bright, really trying to sell that impression of shiny armor. And now since I have so much footage of me doing this edge highlighting, and because I assume hopefully it'll be useful to some people out there who are watching it, I'll just let some of these clips play for a little while. Obviously, feel free to skip to the next timestamps if you start getting bored of them. I did also take some black and glaze it a couple times into the shadows, just to bring those a little bit darker in some places. The red armor I layered up a bit more, bringing it up to a strong red, and then starting to mix in white for my edge highlights and specular highlights. I know this will be a shocker, but I also pushed these highlights very bright. Just like with the black armor, I'll let this footage of the layering and then edge highlights play for quite a while, so just skip ahead to the next part if you don't want to watch all that. I also don't have any footage to show of this, but in some spots I felt like the red got turned a little too pinkish by all of the white highlights. This was more of an issue on Gar Saxon himself, since the red armor panels on his armor are much smaller surfaces, where the edges make up proportionally more of the surface. To fix this, I just took a thick glaze of red and just pulled that from the highlights back into the midtones, bringing back some of the red hue. This does pull down the highlights a bit too, so I did try to avoid the very brightest highlights when doing that. Not gonna lie, that was a lot of time and effort, but that was pretty much wrapping up the part of these minis that was hardest to paint and took the longest, so it's kind of all downhill from here. Then I did a couple gentle highlights on the jumpsuits, trying not to make them too bright so that they don't compete with the black armor. But I also wanted to make them look a little bit shiny, so I tried to strike a good balance between having bright highlights but not making the jumpsuit look too bright overall. I also used a reddish gray color as my highlight for this, and I did this because I think the models are already pretty busy, and if I highlighted this with sort of a cold blue as I would be normally inclined to do, I think that would just be a lot of contrasting colors between the red and the black and the bluish gray, so I just decided to go a little bit more monochromatic with it and keep it a little bit more towards that red color. Now the last hurdle is the jetpack fire effects. On these Mandalorians, I didn't start with that nicely airbrushed fire and smoke trail, so I just quickly and roughly wet blended white down to a light gray, and then down to a dark gray as I worked further down the smoke trail. I did a couple of passes of the white, just to make sure that it was fairly opaque and bright. Now with that undercoat all set up, I started adding some thin yellow and orange paints. The thin paint works to find the recesses pretty well, but I did end up making it a little too thin and it dried a little bit stainy and messy. But easily fixable later. While I wait for those to dry, I worked on Gar Saxon's glowing visor, the glowing reticle and the sniper rifle muzzle flash, and the other little bits that glow yellow on their armor and helmets. This wasn't anything too fancy. I just started with a white undercoat and painted over it with some somewhat thin yellow. The small glowing bars on the armor and breastplates just got a simple highlight after that, and on the visor I brought in some fluorescent yellow and orange, putting yellow in the center of the T and orange towards the outer edges of it. With that done, and the paint dry on the jump packs, I hit a bit of the splotchy orange color with a heavy dry brush of light gray, doing this over the middle and bottoms of the smoke trails. After that, I did a dark gray dry brush over the lower portion of the trail only. Not only do these dry brush steps help to transition the orange more nicely to gray, they also add a nice rough texture to the smoke trails, which I think helps to mimic a nice real-life smoke effect. Switching back to the airbrush, just like with the Bo-Katan and Clan Kryze, however you pronounce it, Mandalorians, I mixed up a fluorescent orange color I thought matched decently well, and airbrushed that heavily over the top and middle of the flames and smoke, as well as all around the fire on the legs and waist to get some easy object source lighting. Fluorescent paints, at least all of the ones that I have and use, naturally have very bad coverage, so they do still let you see your highlights nicely underneath them. I intentionally went very intense with this as well, since I want the fire to be a big component of these minis. And to reclaim some of that yellow, I thinned down a bright yellowish white mix and airbrushed that more conservatively around the flames. I'm pretty sure I added a bit of fluorescent yellow here as well, but honestly I don't really remember. Anyway, all of these steps I also follow on the muzzle flash of Gar Saxon's rifle. Then I just came back with a little bit more fluorescent orange, using it to darken some of the areas that got a little bit too yellow. There are a final few steps that I didn't film after this, just some small bits of cleanup and some final highlights by brush, as well as a quick thin coat of matte varnish, but that's pretty much it. Painting these Mandalorians was a bit of a test of patience when it came to edge highlighting all of these armor panels, but they were still a lot of fun to work on. The NMM definitely took a while, and I think it turned out well, but definitely it is a little more on the simple side, and it isn't expert level or anything close to that. But as I mentioned before, it's fun practice, and I really like the result. Working with the larger scale of these Shatterpoint minis was also a good change of pace for me. And if you think about it, working at this scale is kind of a great bridge back into painting the Oathsworn minis, which are also this larger scale, right? Anyway, that's all I've got this time around. I will actually be painting Oaths 4 next and getting back to that. So, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little interlude, and I hope you have a great day.